Welcome back to Face the Nation. For a closer look at some of the major issues we're facing abroad, we turn to Kori Schake, who is a distinguished fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. Her new book is Safe Passage: The Transition from British to American Hegemony. Michael O'Hanlon, a senior fellow and director of research at the Brookings Institute, is here, and he, of course, is in Washington. Kori, let me start with you. I tried to get the UN ambassador to give me a sense of why now on Jerusalem. Why now?
It's not clear why now. I think the White House is hoping that it will push the peace process forward by, as Nikki Haley said, taking Jerusalem off the table. I think that's unlikely to prove true. I think it's going to make the peace process a lot more complicated because it doesn't look like they had anything to offer Palestinians. Right. And so it's surprising that other countries in the region care less, in part because they need more cooperation from Israel now than before.
Michael, what's your view? People see this violence, how should they see this? Big deal? Should they be nervous? What's your sense?
Well, I'm glad you asked it that way, John, because I think it's a medium deal. It's not the end of the world. President Trump didn't say that East Jerusalem could never be the capital for Palestine. He didn't make any other such declarations that were really out of what we all expect in any kind of a final peace agreement anyway. And of course, the peace process, even though Kori's totally right that this is not helpful for the peace process, it wasn't exactly going anyplace anyway. So I think there are bigger questions about what kind of leverage can we create with both parties, and perhaps we need to think harder about that. But I don't see this as more than what my colleague Natan Sachs calls an unforced error. In other words, it's not a tragedy. It's probably a mistake. It probably complicates the atmosphere. I'm not sure it really changes the terms of any potential peace deal or really impedes any negotiation that was having any momentum to begin with.
Let's talk now about a place where an unforced error could lead to a tragedy, which is North Korea. Kori, what's happening right now? Americans hear, it's perilous, and then the issue goes away, and then it becomes perilous again. How should people think about this?
Well, I am more concerned about it now. I think what I hear out of the White House parallels pretty closely what the Bush administration sounded like in 2003 in the run-up to the Iraq War, that the leadership of North Korea is fundamentally erratic and untrustworthy, that retaliation is inadequate as a strategy, and I think they're not thinking through quite carefully enough, for example, what Asia will look like geopolitically if the United States engages in a preventative war that the Australians, Japanese, and South Koreans don't want and might not participate in.
Michael, Kori raises 2003. This president has said that lead up to the Iraq War and the war itself was the greatest blunder in American history. So parallels to that, that should make people nervous.
And this would probably be 100 times more lethal for Allied forces than the Iraq War. We have to keep that in mind. Let's say the North Koreans can only detonate 1 or 2 nuclear weapons, but they're over Seoul. Then we have up to a couple 100,000 Americans in Seoul. Leave aside the issue of whether the families of American servicemen should come home. There are a lot of American civilians who just live there doing business. So if we were to have a war in Korea, the estimates are that 1 nuclear explosion over that densely populated city could kill about 2 or 3 times as many people as the Hiroshima or Nagasaki bomb. And that's for 1 explosion. So anything that leads us towards a higher probability of nuclear war, I think is probably a huge mistake. But there is, I don't want to be too scary, there is one potential interpretation of what's going on that's a little more hopeful, which is that the Trump administration really doesn't have particular interest at the end of the day in launching a preventive war, but by creating the sense that they're impatient, they're trying to persuade China to turn the economic screws more forcefully and try to get us in a better bargaining position. I'm not comfortable with this situation because I don't know if what I just said is true, and if the alternative interpretation is true, then we could be in for a horrible war, the worst since World War II.
Moreover, the administration is painting themselves into a corner with the rhetoric, even if it is just intended to make the Chinese more cooperative. They are saying that the sand is slipping through the hourglass and we might have to act soon, and the military option is the only option if this doesn't work. And that actually, I think, not only creates a red line, it attaches a ticking clock to it.
If I could add, the question too, I agree 100% with Kori. The question is, what are the military options under consideration? All-out preventive war is, of course, the extreme. There's also one idea that Ash Carter and Bill Perry, two former secretaries of defense of the Democratic Party, wrote about 10 years ago. They're not necessarily articulating it now, but 11 years ago, they suggested that we shoot down a North Korean ICBM launch before it either gets off the launch pad or before it gets out of the atmosphere, and just deny North Korea the ability to really learn more about its missile programs. That's the kind of that's a very dangerous idea too, because you don't know what North Korea is going to do in response. But that's the sort of idea that may be in play here.
Let me step back here for a second and ask you all both a question about the larger buildup of forces. There is in the Congress a request for even more money than the president has asked for his defense budget. Kori, what do you think will happen with that? And do we need all this money?
I'm skeptical that the Congress is actually going to pass an appropriations bill that will give the Defense Department the $700 billion that authorizers in Congress have asked for. It looks to me much more likely that we will see a series of continuing resolutions. We're already a third of the way into the fiscal year. So I'm really skeptical, both because of the way the president's budget teed this up. So Congress is going to be adding $100 billion over what the president requested. But I'm also skeptical that they can get deals on the other things like DACA, like the spending distinction between domestic and national security. It looks to me like this is likely to drag on, and that's actually terrible for the Defense Department. Continuing resolutions prevent them starting new programs. It prevents the managerial latitude that DoD needs to use the money well. So rather than add more money, I would instead give DoD the latitude to do a lot more programmatic management. I think that would help them a lot more.
Michael, your thought?
Amen. I mean, we're at a point here in December, 2.5 months into the new fiscal year. We don't know if the defense budget is going to be $600 billion for this year or $700 billion. That's a huge gap, and that's roughly the range of play. And Donald Trump is sort of in between in his request. I'm sort of in between myself. The Congress, under Senator McCain and Congressman Thornberry and others, have proposed the $700 billion. Anything north of $600 billion exceeds the Cold War average when you adjust for inflation. I do think we need a bit more money. But I think what we need really is clarity and a decision, because you can't do proper training, maintenance, you can't enter into long-term contracts, you can't just do good custodianship of the Department of Defense when you're this far into the year and you don't know what your budget will be.
All right, that's it for both of you. Thank you so much. And we'll be right back to discuss the political news of the week with our political panel.